Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, feeling a presence in the room, only to find yourself paralyzed by fear? In this video, I'm going to share a chilling true story about the night my fiancé and I encountered a terrifying figure in our old apartment. It's a night that changed our lives forever, leaving us with questions that still haunt us to this day. What would you do if you saw a shadowy figure standing beside your bed, staring down at your loved one? How would you react if you realized that your nightmares were shared by someone else, in the exact same way? Join me as I recount the spine-tingling details of that night, from the eerie lucid dream to the shocking discovery that we both experienced the same horrifying presence. If you love real-life horror stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Let's dive into this nightmare together and uncover the fear that still lingers. My fiancé and I lived in an old eerie apartment building that always gave me the creeps. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed to whisper secrets, and the floors creaked no matter how softly you walked. The building was ancient, with a history that seemed to seep into every corner. The hallways were dimly lit, casting long, unsettling shadows that danced on the walls. Our apartment was tiny, but it was home. The space was cozy, but there was always this strange, heavy feeling in the air. The neighbors didn't help either. They were all a bit odd, keeping to themselves and rarely making eye contact. There was the old man who always seemed to be watching from his window, and the woman who never spoke but always seemed to be humming a strange tune. It all added to the creepy atmosphere of the place. Despite the unsettling vibe, we had our routines. One of them was always sleeping with the bedroom door closed. It was a small comfort, a barrier between us and the rest of the creepy building. It made us feel a little safer, a little more in control. But one night, we decided to leave the door open. The apartment was stuffy, and we wanted better airflow. It seemed like a small thing at the time, but it was a decision we'd soon regret. That night started out like any other. We brushed our teeth, talked about our day, and got into bed. I remember feeling a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off. I figured it was just the usual creepiness of the building getting to me. We settled in, leaving the door ajar to let the cool air circulate. As I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt different with the door open, more exposed. But I told myself it was just my imagination. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, my fiancé's steady breathing beside me a comforting sound. At some point during the night, I felt myself wake up. But it was strange, I realized I was in a lucid dream. Everything felt so real, but I knew I was dreaming. I started to look around the room, everything looked the same as when I had fallen asleep. But then, as my eyes scanned the room, I noticed something. Outside our bedroom door, in the small excuse for a hallway, the ceiling seemed higher than usual. And there, in the upper right corner, I saw a figure. It was black, completely devoid of features, and it was hanging there, suspended in the air. My heart started to race, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I blinked, hoping it would disappear. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was no longer in the corner. It was standing right next to my bed. I could make out the silhouette of a woman, and she was staring down at my fiancé. I felt frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The figure reached out and touched my fiancé's shoulder, and I watched in horror as she went limp, as if all the life had been drained out of her. Panic surged through me, and I desperately reached out to grab the figure. I screamed, and the sound of my scream jolted me awake. I sat up in bed, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. It took me a moment to realize that I was back in my bedroom, and everything was as it should be. I quickly turned to check on my fiancée. She was still there, breathing peacefully. Relief flooded through me, but I couldn't shake the fear. When she woke up, she saw the look on my face and asked what was wrong. I told her about the dream, every horrifying detail. She listened, her face growing pale. Then she told me that she had a dream too, one that felt strange and abnormal, like something was watching her sleep. We didn't go back to sleep that night. We stayed up, talking and trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, we decided to leave that apartment as soon as we could. The experience was too much, too terrifying to ignore. We packed our things and found a new place, somewhere that didn't have the heavy, eerie atmosphere of that old building. It was a lesson we wouldn't forget. Sometimes, the past leaves its mark in ways we can't explain. That night, as I lay in bed next to my fiancée, I felt myself drifting into sleep. Everything seemed normal at first, the usual sounds of the old apartment settling and the faint hum of the city outside our window. But suddenly, I found myself awake again. Or at least, I thought I was awake. It was an odd feeling, like I was aware of being in a dream, but everything felt so real. I realized I was having a lucid dream. It was strange, but there was a calmness about it at first. I could see our bedroom clearly, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting a soft glow through the window, the familiar shadows of our furniture, and the comforting presence of my fiancée beside me. It all seemed so ordinary, yet I knew I was dreaming. I decided to look around, curious about the dream's realism. I glanced around the room, taking in the details. The way the light hit the walls, the slight creak of the floorboards under my weight as I shifted, everything felt so vivid. I even reached out to touch the bedside table, feeling its solidness beneath my fingers. It was uncanny how real it all seemed. As I continued to explore the room with my eyes, something caught my attention. Just outside our bedroom door, in the small hallway, the ceiling seemed higher than usual. It was an odd detail that didn't make sense. My gaze traveled upward, and that's when I saw it. There, in the upper right corner of the hallway, was a figure. It was completely black, a silhouette with no discernible features. It was hanging there, suspended in mid-air, like it was defying gravity. My heart started to race, a cold sweat forming on my brow. The calmness of the dream shattered, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I tried to convince myself it was just a part of the dream, something my mind had conjured up. But the figure felt wrong, out of place, too real in a way that made my skin crawl. I blinked, hoping it would disappear, hoping it was just a trick of my imagination. When I opened my eyes, the figure was no longer in the corner. It was standing right beside my bed. The transition was so sudden, so jarring, that I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. It was the silhouette of a woman, dark and featureless, and she was staring down at my fiancé. I wanted to move, to scream, but I was frozen with fear. My body wouldn't respond, as if the weight of the dream was holding me down. The figure reached out a hand and touched my fiancé's shoulder. I watched in horror as my fiancé's body went limp, her life seemingly drained away by the touch. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis. I reached out to grab the figure, my hands closing around its shadowy form. I squeezed as hard as I could, screaming in terror and desperation. The scream felt like it tore through the fabric of the dream, pulling me back into reality. I jolted awake, sitting up in bed with a gasp. My scream echoed in the quiet room, the terror still fresh in my mind. My heart was pounding, my body shaking. I quickly turned to my fiancée, relief flooding through me when I saw she was still there, breathing peacefully beside me. She woke up, startled by my scream. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I told her everything, the dream, the figure, the terrifying experience. As I spoke, she grew pale, her eyes widening in fear. "I had a dream too," she said, her voice trembling. It felt like something was watching me, something dark and menacing. We spent the rest of the night wide awake, too scared to close our eyes, talking and trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, we both knew we couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The experience had been too real, too terrifying. We packed our things and left, finding a new place to call home. The memory of that night stayed with us, a chilling reminder of the strange and unexplained things that sometimes intrude upon our lives. As I lay there in the eerie silence of my dream, my eyes were fixed on the dark figure hanging in the hallway. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, completely black, with no discernible features, just a silhouette suspended in mid-air. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't look away. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, but it felt so real, so terrifyingly real. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure moved. One moment it was hanging in the hallway, and the next, it was standing right beside our bed. The transition was so sudden and smooth, like it had just glided through the air. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the sight of it standing there, close enough to touch. The figure was tall, with the unmistakable shape of a woman. Her form was still a solid black silhouette, completely featureless, yet I could feel her eyes, or what should have been eyes, boring into my fiancée. It was as if she was studying her, fixated on her with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. My fear began to mount. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak. I wanted to reach out, to pull my fiancée closer and protect her, but my body wouldn't respond. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if the very presence of the figure was sucking the warmth and life out of the space. As I watched in helpless horror, the figure started to move again. This time, she slowly extended a hand towards my fiancé. Her movements were deliberate and slow, almost like she was savoring the moment. My fiancé lay there, completely unaware of the dark presence looming over her. The closer the figure's hand got to my fiancé, the more intense my panic became. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound would come out. It was as if my voice had been stolen by the fear gripping my heart. Finally, the figure's hand reached my fiancé's shoulder. The moment it made contact, I saw my fiancé's body go limp. It was like all the life had been drained out of her in an instant. Her breathing became shallow and slow, and her face lost all its color. The sight was too much to bear. That was the breaking point for me. The terror surged through me, and I found the strength to move. I reached out and grabbed the figure's arm, my fingers closing around the shadowy form. It felt cold and insubstantial, like I was gripping a wisp of smoke, but I held on as tight as I could. I screamed, the sound finally tearing from my throat with a force that shook me awake. I bolted upright in bed, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. My scream echoed through the room, mingling with the sounds of my frantic breathing. For a moment, I was disoriented, not sure if I was still dreaming. But then I felt the bed beneath me, solid and real, and I saw my fiancée beside me, still breathing. Relief flooded through me, but the fear didn't entirely leave. I reached out to touch her, to make sure she was okay. She stirred at my touch, waking up with a look of concern on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy with sleep. I told her everything, about the dream, the figure, and the moment of terror when I thought I'd lost her. As I spoke, she listened, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "I had a dream too," she said when I finished, her voice trembling. It felt like something was watching me, something dark and menacing. The realization that we had both experienced something so similar sent chills down my spine. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep, talking and trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, we both knew we couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The experience had been too real, too terrifying. We packed our things and left, seeking refuge in a new home where we hoped we'd be free from the shadows of that old building. As I lay there, paralyzed by fear, I watched the figure's hand inch closer to my fiancée. The room seemed to grow colder with each passing second, and the silence was deafening. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, except everything felt disturbingly real. Finally, the figure's hand made contact with my fiancée's shoulder. The moment it touched her, I saw the life drain out of her body. Her breathing became shallow and erratic, her skin turned a ghastly pale, and her entire body went limp. It was as if the figure had sucked the very essence of life from her. My fiancée, who had been peacefully sleeping beside me just moments before, now looked lifeless and cold. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had held me captive. I reached out with all my strength, my hands closing around the figure's shadowy arm. It felt cold and insubstantial, like I was grabbing onto a dense fog. But I held on tight, fueled by sheer desperation and fear. I had to save her, I had to do something. My grip tightened as I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with a raw intensity. The scream felt like it shattered the very fabric of the dream, pulling me back into reality. I jolted awake, sitting up in bed with a gasp, my scream echoing through the dark room. I was drenched in sweat, my body shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, I was disoriented, not sure if I was still dreaming or if I had truly woken up. But then I felt the bed beneath me, solid and real, and I saw my fiancée beside me, still breathing. Relief flooded through me, but the terror didn't entirely leave. I reached out to touch her, needing to feel her warmth, to make sure she was okay. She stirred at my touch, waking up with a look of concern on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. I was still trembling, my heart racing, as I tried to find the words to explain what had just happened. I told her about the dream, about the figure, and the moment of sheer horror when I thought I'd lost her. As I spoke, she listened, her eyes widening with shock and fear. "I had a dream too," she said when I finished, her voice trembling. It felt like something was watching me, something dark and menacing. The realization that we had both experienced something so similar sent chills down my spine. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep, talking and trying to make sense of what had happened. The room felt colder, more menacing, as if the figure from my dream was still lurking in the shadows. Every creak and groan of the old building set us on edge, and the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. The next day, we knew we couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The experience had been too real, too terrifying. We packed our things and left, seeking refuge in a new home where we hoped we'd be free from the shadows of that old building. The memory of that night stayed with us, a chilling reminder of the strange and unexplained things that sometimes intrude upon our lives. Even now, I can still feel the icy touch of that shadowy figure and see the lifeless look on my fiancée's face in the dream. It's a nightmare that haunts me, a story I share with others to warn them that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are more real than we'd like to believe. When I finally woke up from the terrifying dream, my first instinct was to check on my fiancée. I turned quickly and saw her lying there, breathing softly. Relief washed over me like a wave, and I felt a huge weight lift off my chest. She was alive. It had just been a nightmare. I reached out and gently touched her arm, needing to feel her warmth to reassure myself that she was okay. My touch woke her up, and she looked at me with sleepy eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. I was still shaking, my heart racing from the fear I had felt in the dream. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down enough to explain what had happened. "I had the most terrifying dream," I started, my voice trembling. "There was this dark figure, a woman, and she was standing beside the bed, looking at you. She reached out and touched you, and it was like she drained all the life out of you. I grabbed her and screamed, and then I woke up." As I spoke, I saw her expression change. Her eyes widened, and she sat up, fully awake now. "That's so strange," she said, her voice shaky. "I had a weird dream too. It felt like something was watching me, something dark and menacing. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. It was so unsettling." We sat there in the dim light of our bedroom, sharing our experiences. The more we talked, the more we realized how similar our dreams had been. It wasn't just a coincidence. There was something deeply disturbing about the fact that we had both felt the same sense of dread and fear. "I felt like I couldn't move," she continued. "I was trying to scream to wake you up, but I couldn't make a sound. It was like I was paralyzed with fear. And then just before I woke up, I felt this cold touch on my shoulder. That's when I saw your face and you woke me up." Her words sent chills down my spine. The details of her dream matched mine so closely that it was impossible to ignore. It felt like we had both been touched by the same dark presence, even though it was just a dream. The fear lingered, making it hard to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to stay up for the rest of the night, too scared to go back to sleep. We talked about anything and everything, trying to distract ourselves from the terror we had both experienced. Every little sound in the apartment made us jump, and the shadows seemed darker and more threatening. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, we finally started to relax a little. The fear hadn't entirely left, but it felt more manageable in the daylight. We knew we couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The experience had been too real, too frightening. "We need to move," I said, and she nodded in agreement. "We can't stay here after what happened. It's just too much." We made plans to start looking for a new place as soon as possible. The apartment, which had once been our cozy home, now felt like a place of fear and darkness. Over the next few days, we packed our things and searched for a new apartment. We didn't talk much about the dreams, but the memory of that night lingered between us. It was a shared experience that had shaken us both to the core. Eventually, we found a new place and moved in. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to leave the nightmares behind. But even now, whenever I think about that old apartment, I can't help but feel a shiver of fear. The memory of the dark figure and the shared sense of dread is something I'll never forget. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what it was that we experienced. Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more sinister at play? I don't have the answers, but I know one thing for sure: that night changed us both, and we'll always be a little more cautious about the things that go bump in the night. After we shared our terrifying dreams, we knew we couldn't go back to sleep that night. The fear was too fresh, too intense. We stayed up, huddled together in our bed, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. Every creak of the old apartment building, every gust of wind outside, made us jump. We talked about anything and everything to keep our minds off the dark figure and the eerie feeling that still lingered. When the first light of dawn finally started to seep through the curtains, we felt a bit of relief. The daylight made everything seem less frightening, but the memory of the night was still vivid in our minds. We knew we couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The decision was mutual and immediate. We needed to leave as soon as possible. We spent the next few days in a flurry of activity, packing up our belongings and searching for a new place to live. Every moment spent in the apartment was tense. We tried to avoid thinking about the dark figure, but it was impossible to completely forget. The fear was like a shadow, always lurking in the back of our minds. As we packed, we spoke in hushed tones, afraid of stirring up whatever presence we had felt. The normally mundane task of packing boxes felt charged with urgency. We moved quickly, trying to get out of the apartment as fast as we could. We didn't sleep much during those days, driven by a need to escape the place that had turned from a home into a nightmare. Finally, we found a new apartment. It was in a newer building, with lots of natural light and a fresh, open feel. It was everything our old place wasn't. We moved in as quickly as possible, hoping that the new environment would help us leave the fear behind. But even in our new home, the experience left a lasting impact. We found ourselves double-checking locks, closing doors tightly at night, and jumping at every unexpected sound. The dark figure and the shared nightmare had shaken us deeply. It was hard to feel completely safe, even in a place that was bright and new. My fiancée and I talked often about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. We questioned whether it had just been a coincidence, a product of our minds, or something more sinister. We researched sleep paralysis and lucid dreaming, looking for explanations, but nothing quite matched what we had experienced. Sometimes, we would wake up in the middle of the night, hearts pounding, and look at each other to make sure everything was okay. The fear had become a part of our nightly routine, a lingering reminder of that terrifying night. We were more cautious, more aware of our surroundings, and less willing to dismiss strange occurrences. Over time, the intensity of the fear faded, but it never completely went away. The memory of the dark figure and the shared sense of dread stayed with us. It was a chapter of our lives that we couldn't close completely, no matter how much we tried. We learned to live with it, to accept that some things couldn't be fully explained. Moving out of that old apartment was the right decision for us. It allowed us to start fresh, to build new memories in a place that didn't carry the weight of fear and unease. But the experience made us more aware, more cautious, and more connected to each other. We knew that, whatever came our way, we could face it together. Now, when I think back to that night, it feels like a distant nightmare, yet it's always there, lurking in the shadows of my mind. The figure, the fear, the shared experience, it's all a part of who we are now. It's a story we share with others, a warning about the things that sometimes go bump in the night. Our new apartment is filled with light and laughter, but we never forget the lesson we learned. Sometimes, the past leaves marks that are invisible but deeply felt. And sometimes, the things we fear most are the ones that come when we least expect them.